Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comet Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Laverton. Welcome to Conversing. What a gift it is today to welcome Yuval Levin as our guest on Conversing. Dr. Yuval Levin is the Director of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he also holds the Beth and Ravenel Currie Chair in Public Policy. He's the leader and founder of National Affairs and the editor. He's also the senior editor of the new Atlantis and a contributing editor of the National Review, as well as a contributing opinion writer at the New York Times. Yuval holds degrees from American University in political science and holds an MA and PhD from the Committee on Social Thought at the University of Chicago. Today, we're going to have an opportunity to discuss his most recent book, American Covenant: How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again. Yuval, thank you so much for joining me today on Conversing.
Thanks for having me, Mark. It's such a treat to be with you.
Well, as I've said, it's a great honor to me because we've had opportunity over the last few years to get acquainted, and I'm very aware of my intellectual respect for you and my respect for your intellectual project, which is really in part at the very heart of what this conversation today is going to be about. But it's not just that. It's also that I have great regard for you as a person and as a person of faith. So I'd love for you to just tell the audience a bit more about yourself, your background, your own faith tradition, and so forth.
Yeah, well, professionally, I'm a recovering political scientist who kind of works at the intersection of theory and practice in Washington. Personally, I'm a Jewish American. I'm an immigrant to the United States. I came here from Israel as a child, so I grew up in America, but have in some ways the kind of vision that sometimes immigrants have, which combines a really deep gratitude for this country with a sense of what's unique about it and what's wonderfully strange about it. And being Jewish in America is part of that too. It's a recognition of yourself as part of a minority community. And the United States is really unusually protective and welcoming of such communities in a way that has absolutely informed how I think about my work, too. The work I do is not explicitly on Jewish questions usually, but it's very informed by my formation as a Jewish American.
Right. So both as an immigrant and as a Jewish American in particular.
Absolutely.
What is your religious practice?
Well, my family belongs to a conservative Jewish congregation, and we are part of a really thriving community, which is in some ways a strange thing to say. Conservative Judaism is not generally thriving in the United States. It lives kind of between the Orthodox and the Reform, both of which are a little larger. But where I live in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., we actually have a very large, very thriving, a lot of kids in our synagogue, a large active community. It's on the Orthodox side of the conservative movement, I would say, and certainly my own faith, my own practice has become more traditional over the years, as happens when you have kids and when you just become a serious person. But in a way, I grew up in this world. My mother was, for many years, the principal of the religious school in our conservative Jewish community where I grew up in New Jersey, and my parents, in an interesting way, kind of discovered conservative Judaism in the United States. When they moved from Israel, they were not particularly religious people. In Israel, you have to choose between a fairly rigorous orthodoxy and really a kind of secular Jewish life, which is the majority in Israel. And my parents here discovered a middle ground that really spoke to them. And in an odd way, they became more seriously Jewish. Certainly my mother did after moving to the United States.
Wow, that's very interesting. One of the things that I want to explore when we come to discussing this great new book you've written is the way that the Torah has shaped you. It's the conversation we're going to be having is about the Constitution and about some extremely illuminating insights I think that you share about it. But that is to say that it is a text, a defining text for the nation, and your faith has emerged as a defining text for your life. And there is for me in my reading of your book resonances between Torah and reading texts carefully and the work that you've done on the Constitution. Can you talk first just about how Torah has shaped you?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really interesting that you say that. And I would say in thinking about the subject of this book, the American Constitution, I definitely again and again encountered various kinds of ways of thinking about a legal text that have everything to do with the fact that the Jews think about the Torah in a certain way. Torah describes the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, but the word just means law. And
yes.
The approach to the Torah is, in a way, an approach to the law, and a very distinct approach. It's text-minded.
Right.
It is really all about the words, but it's very interpretive in its approach.
Yes.
It is about how do we make sense of these words in this situation where certainly the meaning of the words is the essence, but the situation is also very relevant to how you encounter them and to what you make of them. And some of the ways that I've thought about the kind of founding documents of the American regime, which are so much part of my work, sometimes I step back and just recognize how Jewish they are. I went through a 5-year period where I read in a cycle the Federalist Papers across the year. The Federalist Papers were published as newspaper articles over the course of 18 months. There's a date on each of them, and I would read each of them in the analogous date and to try to get a sense of what it was like to read them as a contemporary reader.
Right.
And of course, that's how Jews read the Bible.
Yes.
You work through an annual cycle of reading. And I didn't really have that in mind, but after doing it for a while, I realized, look at what I'm doing here.
Right.
And I think in part, it's just a good way to read. It's a way to really immerse yourself in a meaningful text. And I don't confuse the two. The American Constitution is not divine. It's the work of a patchwork of compromises. It has a lot of problems. By no means do I think that it's analogous to the Hebrew Bible, but as a way of reading a text, I think there's a lot to be learned from how people of faith approach biblical text.
Yeah. So this book, American Covenant, and subtitled How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again, is just out, and it is, in my view, not as a constitutional scholar in the least, but as a person who takes the Constitution seriously and foundationally for American life and culture and politics. To me, it was just a tremendously stimulating read, both because I respect the care with which it's written, and you are an exceptionally good writer, so your ability to take really complicated things and make them as clear as they can supportively be when you're actually talking about things that are pretty messy a lot of the time. So the sorting out you've done is very helpful. But let's just start with a foundational question. Why this book and why now?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I really appreciate that. Thank you. And in a certain way, why now is almost the easiest question for me to take up around this book, because this is really a book about how to understand the Constitution as a framework for cohesion, for unity.
Yes.
It's a book about how this society, divided as it is, might hold together. And that's a question that we just all have to live with now. And it's a question that presents itself constantly in our public life. But even in the private lives of a lot of Americans, I think the sense of isolation, of alienation, breakdown of social cohesion is very powerful in the lives of a lot of people. And this is one way to approach that question. It's not the only way. And really, a lot of my work over the last 10 years or so has been about that question from various angles. But it occurred to me in thinking about the divisions in our politics that we treat the Constitution almost as a source of division now. We think of it as one of the reasons we're alienated from each other. But actually, the Constitution is intended to unify a divided society. And we don't think of it that way because we've left it to the lawyers to tell us what the Constitution is for a very long time. I'm not a lawyer. As I say, I'm a recovering political scientist. And the Constitution presents itself as a framework for holding a society together. When it says what it's going to do, the first thing it says is that its purpose is to form a more perfect union.
Yes.
And I think we ought to take that seriously and to look at it particularly through the eyes of those of its authors and practitioners who were most concerned with this question. And they weren't lawyers either. The voice that really resonates in this book is James Madison's.
Yes.
James Madison was not a lawyer. He was a politician, lifelong politician. And he thought about society in a way that really highlighted the centrality of unity and cohesion. And so I think the Constitution has a lot to teach us in this moment about how to hang together. It doesn't mean there aren't things we need to change, but I think it's worth our seeing that it has something really to say to us about the problem we face now. It is not a relic. It's not an artifact of the late 18th century. It's an answer to a question that we still ask.
Right, right. Yuval, why do you think the Constitution has become, for so many people, I think both on the left and on the right, people who consider the Constitution to be a source of division, as you just suggested. What is it historically that has developed in that way? If Madison and the framers began with a commitment to unity, it was certainly not because America was unified, nor because it lacked diversity of opinion, even in the time that it was being written in the late 18th century. So give us the arc that you do trace, I think, quite meaningfully in the book.
Well, I think there are a couple of things going on. I would say that one is that we do live in a time when the public life of our society feels awfully divided. We are polarized. Yes. There's no more obvious cliche now than that we are polarized, and it's true. Part of what that means is that Americans tend to approach politics by thinking of other Americans as the problem to be solved, as if the challenge we face is that there are these people who disagree with us and stand in our way and make it impossible for our society to flourish. And as if the very diversity of our society, the very fact that people differ about pretty fundamental questions, makes it impossible for us to be unified. And the Constitution rises to say, no, that's a misimpression of what it would mean to be unified. So in any free society, there are always going to be divisions. And in a very interesting way, that is just a premise of the authors of the Constitution. And Madison, more than anybody, makes that premise explicit. He says in Federalist 10, maybe his greatest work on this subject, he says just simply, as long as the reason of man continues fallible and he's at liberty to exercise it, different opinions will be formed. The fact that we disagree is not a failure. It is a reality. And yet, that doesn't mean that we can't be unified. And the reason is that there's an idea of unity that I think maybe is the most important thing for us to learn from the Constitution now.
Yes.
An idea implicit in it that says in a free, diverse society, unity doesn't mean thinking alike. Unity means acting together. And the distinction between thinking and acting and between alike and together are both very, very important for us to understand. Yes. In a sense, that idea of unity forces us to ask a question to which the Constitution is an answer. The question is, how can we possibly act together when we don't think alike?
Yes.
And the Constitution is the answer to that question. Just about everything about it forces people who disagree to engage with each other. That's actually what we find frustrating about it. It just won't let us push these people away. And even winning an election doesn't mean you get to ignore the people who disagree with you. Even having a majority in Congress doesn't mean you don't have to work with them. Over and over, the Constitution compels us into building coalitions with precisely the people we disagree with. And I think that is a path to unity that we now tend to deny ourselves. We've lost the knack for coalition building, and the Constitution could remind us of it. So I think part of the reason why we find this moment so frustrating is that we're not responding to the fact of division by looking to build coalitions. We're responding to it with just sheer frustration. And so the Constitution, which forces us constantly to face that fact of division, is very frustrating to a lot of Americans now. And I think seeing what the Constitution is could help us realize that frustration is an invitation to work with people we disagree with. It's not how we treat it now.
At one stage in the book, you make the comment that perhaps a broad way of categorizing the different political and social inclinations of people in their reading of the Constitution is divided among those who are aimed at social order and those who have a burden or aimed at social justice. I thought that single phrase was actually quite fascinating. And if I have that right, then can you tease out what, as large buckets, you want to describe about each of those two ways of perceiving?
It's interesting. So this is that sentence, in a way, is a one-sentence summary of another book of mine, a book called The Great Debate, which I published about 10 years ago, which thinks about the nature of the left and right, without attributing too much meaning to left and right, and I think we shouldn't overstate those. There are, as a general matter, more or less two ways of thinking about the purpose of a free society like ours. There is a way of seeing it as intended to address the challenge of chaos and disorder, and there is a way of seeing it as intended to address the challenge of inequality and injustice. And both of those are correct. Our system is intended to address both of those things. But I would say that there are almost two ways of being a modern liberal citizen. One begins from a premise that I take to be rooted in Judaism and Christianity, the premise of human fallenness, which says that we begin unready for freedom, and we need to be formed and shaped to be capable of freedom. That formation is the purpose of our institutions, and our politics exist to facilitate it. And in the absence of that, that is, if our politics fails, what we will have is disorder and barbarism. And in a sense, politics is about the struggle between chaos and civilization, between barbarism and disorder, and social order, rather. The second way of seeing this question does not necessarily begin from that fallenness. It begins from a sense that the human person is born free and equal, ready for freedom, and that a lot of what happens in society involves institutions oppressing these free people on behalf of the wealthy or the powerful. And that attitude tends to see our society not as a struggle between civilization and barbarism, but as a struggle between oppressor and oppressed.
Yes.
And looks at every political question as involving a side that is oppressing and a side that is oppressed. Those point in two very different directions about the purpose of our politics, the nature of our politics. I think the first thing to say about that distinction is that both sides are partially right, and therefore that it is important to see that some political disputes are about oppressor and oppressed, and there is real injustice in the world, and our politics should strive to uproot it and advance the cause of human equality, because we are equal. That is a fact about human persons. At the same time, it is also true that we are fallen, and that left to our own devices, we will incline toward a very dangerous kind of social breakdown, and therefore that an important part of the purpose of our politics is to provide for not only social order, but the formation of ordered people, and the kinds of institutions that make us capable of freedom, family and religion and education and culture and politics, are important as formative institutions. I think of the struggle between left and right as a struggle between those two ways of understanding our society. And our social order and the political regime created by the Constitution is home to both of those. It is home to a debate between them around a lot of issues and has to make room for them both. To me, what stands out about our Constitution, though, and again, to get back to James Madison, what stands out about Madison is that his priority was not exactly about social justice and equality, and it was not exactly about social order and dynamism. His concern was about social cohesion and unity. And he stands almost alone in our political tradition. I would say Abraham Lincoln joined him for obvious reasons. But Madison saw this himself and emphasized it in a way that is embedded in our Constitution and in a way that serves us extremely well. I think it's worth our seeing. The Constitution is neither a left-wing or right-wing document. It is ultimately about how to hold a society together which has these two sides to it. And so it has a lot to offer us.
Right. So picking up on that then, having spent decades now living in the progressivism of Northern California and the San Francisco Bay Area in particular, the argument that would frequently be made here is that the emphasis on social order feels as though it easily gets charged with the following kinds of accusations, as you well know, that it feels as though it is patient to a fault. It feels as though it slows down the recovery from injustice, which puts many, many people at such dramatic disadvantage and suffering and exclusion that it feels like it's frequently, historically, a patriarchal and a hierarchical kind of there, all in time sort of approach, which can feel both politically ham-handed, and it can feel as though it is also highly prejudicial toward both white culture and toward more elite culture. So respond to those kinds of accusations. I'd love to hear how you would engage that.
I think there are a few things to say there. First of all, these two sides of our politics always have to be learning from each other, and they do have to curb each other's excesses. And the excess of that more conservative side is, as you described, that is a very real danger, and a conservatism uncurbed by progressivism would look like that, and I think it would not be good. And I say that as a conservative. The same is true in the other direction, that if we think of our society purely in terms of oppressor and oppressed, what we end up with is, frankly, a little bit like Northern California, and it's a little bit like a lot of college campuses now, and it looks like a certain kind of ideological extremism and totalitarianism, which is very dangerous. Yeah. These things have to curb each other. But the other thing I'd say is that I think that there is a kind of base stealing in some forms of that argument, which say that the problem with the Constitution is that it's not democratic enough, and therefore it advantages the already powerful and undermines minorities in our society of all sorts. I think that misses a really crucial point that was very powerfully evident to the framers of the Constitution, which is that although majority rule is absolutely necessary as a principle of legitimacy, and the Constitution does ultimately rest on majority rule, the greatest threat to social justice is majority power. And the most dangerous kinds of abuses of the weak happen at the hands of majorities. And therefore, democracy itself has to be constrained by principles of justice that are kept beyond the reach of majorities. And that is the challenge the Constitution is wrestling with. It needs to balance majority rule and minority rights. It does this in a variety of ways. In some ways, it does it by actually articulating rights and describing them as things which are held beyond the reach of majorities. We have a right to the free exercise of religion, and it doesn't matter how big the majority in Congress is to undo that. It cannot be undone. A huge majority in society could do it. You can amend the Constitution, but that's unlikely to happen. And ultimately, these rights exist even when the majority doesn't want them to. But the other way it does this is precisely by creating friction that forces us to work together, by slowing things down and making it necessary for majorities to grow before they can be empowered. And that's what people find frustrating about the Constitution, and it is what you describe in part in that articulation of the objection from the left, is this sense that, the people want this, and we did win the election, and yet we can't do it. If you win an election by a big enough margin, you can do a lot. But we don't really win elections by that big a margin because we really are a divided society. And what that means is that in order to do anything, you do have to negotiate. And I think ultimately that is especially important for the protection of the rights of minorities, for exactly the ideals and goals that progressives come into politics with. The Constitution is an absolutely essential protection. And we live in a time now when progressives are especially frustrated with the Constitution, and especially with its counter-democratic elements, with the Bill of Rights, freedom of religion and speech especially, with the courts, with the Senate, with the Electoral College, all these things that differ from simple majority rule. And somehow the idea is that simple majority rule would be better for protecting minorities. I think that idea makes no sense at all. And it's very important to see that constraints on simple majority rule are actually absolutely essential for precisely the kinds of preventing of oppression that do genuinely matter to serious people on the left.
So the very populism that exists on the right now, for example, which many people are considering a constitutional crisis sort of in its own right, without the Constitution, would potentially allow that to have its own way in such a way that it could become the dominant speech and act.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what's most important to see about that is that populism, even when it wins elections, doesn't speak for a very broad majority. And part of the trouble we have in this moment, and I would say 21st century American politics, is actually that we do have only narrow majorities. We call ourselves polarized, and that's true, but I think even more important than polarization is a kind of deadlock in our politics.
Yes.
Where we haven't had a majority party in American political life for the last 30 years. That's actually very unusual historically. Generally speaking, when you look in on America, you would find a majority party holding a very complicated coalition together and a minority party trying to grow its coalition. And both of those are engaged in coalition building.
Right.
In this moment, since about the middle of the 1990s, we have these two minority parties simultaneously. Sometimes one of them barely ekes out an election victory because the other is even less popular. But neither of them really wins as a popular force in our politics.
Right.
And that means that neither of them is really engaged in coalition building. They do this thing where they lose an election and say, well, we'll just do the same thing next time and it'll work. And they're right. It does work. And so we're in a very frustrating place where the instinct for coalition building is not being allowed to play out. And breaking out of that, I think, requires not breaking down the Constitution, but recurring to the logic of the Constitution. And that's just not intuitive right now. It's part of why I think a book like this is needed to help people see what we're facing, because it's not obvious that that's the problem we have.
I'm Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me. So this is what I thought was particularly compelling about the book, and that is the treatment of Congress. So in the course of the book, for our listeners, you go through the process of looking at the Constitution overall, and you make specific comments in particular about Congress, about the presidency, and about the judiciary. And it was the part about the Congress, because it is so locked, as you've said, and because it is surrounded by such a polarized society, and because of the argument that actually the Constitution helps show us a way through this, which is about finding coalitions and building arguments and actions, back to what you said a few moments ago, about shared action rather than shared ideas necessarily, is really a compelling part of the book to me. Now, I will say that it also strikes me at times like you're almost describing a fantastical world that, given our current state, feels almost unimaginable. I mean, that it was what you're describing. That would just be the most awesome, awesome thing. But that's just not the way that it plays. So, of course, you know that better than I do. So what would you want to add to the listeners' understanding?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I would say Congress is at the center of this argument. It's the central chapter of the book, and it is the central institution of the American regime. Precisely because the Constitution ultimately is founded in the notion that what's required for holding the country together is acting together when we don't think alike, the legislature is the central actor in that system.
Yes.
Because that's where we act together when we don't think alike. And the acting is a negotiating process. Congress is representative. The other institutions, some of them are elected, but none of them are really intended to be representative. This is a vast, diverse country, so only a plural institution really could be representative. And it is ultimately meant to function as a means of elevating the differences that exist in the public and channeling them through an institutional structure that lets them be worked out. The public as a whole could not work out our differences about immigration, but a body of a couple of hundred people whose job is to negotiate, they could if they understood their job. Now, as you say, apparently they can't. Right? They've been trying to work this out, say, on immigration for 25 years. And there clearly is something broken in Congress. But I think that to see it in the context of the broader constitutional moment would help us recognize what is broken in Congress, because that's actually not obvious. Everybody agrees the institution is dysfunctional. I don't think everybody agrees about what function it isn't performing. The natural thing to say in looking at Congress is, well, they're just not passing the big legislation, so they're not doing their job. And in a way, that's true. But what Congress isn't doing is that it isn't facilitating cross-partisan bargaining and negotiation.
Yes.
And a lot of members now don't even think that that's the job. So in other words, they don't even know what they're not doing.
Yes.
They think of their job as more expressive, as being there to stand in for their voters and say the thing that the Fox or MSNBC viewer would once said in this room.
Right.
That's really not how being a representative in a democracy works. Their job is actually to negotiate with the other party. And we've gotten to a place where the most engaged people in our politics, the people who show up to vote on primary election day, don't want their politicians to negotiate with the other party. And they consider that kind of negotiating a failure of nerve or a kind of squishiness.
Yes.
And so they actively don't want their politicians to do their jobs. I think that's fed a kind of attitude among a lot of prominent politicians in America that says fighting for my constituents means yelling at the other party.
Right.
And refusing to give ground, refusing to give an inch. That's actually not what fighting looks like in our kind of democracy. That's what losing looks like. Fighting looks like effectively bargaining and negotiating so as to achieve something of what your voters want or need.
Right.
And the structure of the Congress can remind members of that, but they're facing very powerful counterforces and incentives from the political culture.
Yes.
Their incentive is to be prominent on cable news and on the internet for forcing the other side to hear the things they don't want to hear. And that's a very different incentive than the one that the system is actually intended to create for politicians.
Right.
So I do think we have to see that means the system is failing. And articulating the purposes of the Constitution and the potential that it has is not a way of saying that it doesn't need reform.
Right.
It is rather a way of helping us to see what reform should try to achieve and therefore what it should look like.
Yes.
So I think in thinking about how to fix Congress, we have to think about how to enable it to better facilitate negotiating and bargaining. Because there is an alternative. The alternative is, how do we change Congress so that it doesn't require negotiating and bargaining? And actually, that's what a lot of reformers are after. You know, there's a little community of congressional reformers in Washington, and I often find myself as the token conservative in the various rooms that they meet in. And they all want to get rid of the requirement for negotiating and bargaining, in essence. They want to get rid of the filibuster. They want to centralize power in the hands of leaders. And the argument they make for it is not crazy. They say, look, elections should matter. This party won the election. It should just get to do what it wants. That's actually how a lot of democracies work. It's how the parliamentary democracies work.
Right, exactly.
It's not how our system works. And to help people see that our system is actually better suited to helping a divided society be more unified than that takes a lot of steps. I've come to think maybe it takes a book. I don't know. It is a very counterintuitive view, but I think is ultimately the right way to think about the problem we have. And Congress is at the center of what needs to be fixed. It is the most broken institution in the system and the source of most of the other problems in the system.
Right. So when you make this kind of case in those rooms where you've been invited to be the conservative, what is the response back? Well, the response back is that the system is just not democratic enough, and it needs to be more democratic.
And
Right.
I think that's a very simple-minded way of thinking about what democratic means. I would say every democracy is structured. Its institutions have some shape, and they have that shape for a reason. No democracy is perfectly representative, right? You always have to form public views into some organized way of proceeding legislatively. And so the question is, what are you trying to do?
Right.
And if what you're trying to do is to facilitate agreement across lines of difference, I think what you do would look more like the Madisonian Congress. If what you're trying to do is just empower majorities to act, which isn't illegitimate, but I think is just not as good, then the system you design would look more like the British Parliament.
Right.
I think it's hard for people to see the advantage, the appeal of the American system. But the core appeal of it is that narrow majorities are unreliable. They don't last. They have legitimacy problems. They barely won, so they shouldn't be trusted to do big things. They should negotiate with the minority and broaden the coalition.
Right.
That does mean we will do less. We'll get less done, and there's no way around that. The British system, look, you win an election, you just do everything you want. And then the other party wins, and they undo everything you did, and they do everything they want. I don't think that's a better system than one in which you have to work to build broader coalitions and then, over time, achieve durable change. But that's a real debate, and it's I have to say, I'm certainly in the minority among the people who think about Congress on that front. But, you know, this book is about why I think what I think, and hopefully it'll be persuasive to some of them.
Well, I kept finding myself thinking this book is like the launching of an enterprise that should involve the establishment of a whole training program that would educate.
I will tell you, that's part of what we do. So I work at the American Enterprise Institute, and you know, the small band of us who think this way are basically gathered here, and we spend a lot of time with members and staff and try to socialize these ideas.
Yeah, well, it's quite an amazing picture, because whether a person in the end agrees with what you're saying or not, just exactly on point with the coalition building idea. The fact that these ideas are as substantive as they are, as rational as they are, as constitutionally oriented as they are, is all the good reason to have a, quote, negotiated conversation about your book and about the claims that it's making and about the ways of crafting a way through and hopefully beyond this thicket that we're currently caught in. And yet the tangle does seem so deep, and the social divide, the rhetorical divide, the money divide is so real that it's understandable to me that many people become so cynical about government and about the state of things, and therefore they become highly reactionary to say, I just want to like burn it all down. Clearly that is not the right instinct.
I will say,
follow.
I've come to think in the time I've spent in Washington, and I worked for a Speaker of the House and for a congressional committee. I worked for a President of the United States for 4 years. I've come to think that cynicism about politics is actually very naive. That cynics think there's someone in charge back there, and they're against me. And the hard to accept reality is that there actually isn't. And that most people, almost all of the many, many people I've encountered in politics over the last quarter century believe they're doing the right thing for the country. Now, I think some of them are wrong. But they don't think they're wrong, and they have reasons. And they did this with their life because they wanted to improve things. And seeing that is very, very important to being realistic about politics, because change is actually easier than people imagine. Arguments matter more than people imagine, because the people you're dealing with are not cynical Machiavellians. They really believe they're doing good here, and there actually is room to have an argument. Now, we shouldn't be naive. Money does matter, and power does matter. These are real, but they're not the only things that matter.
Right. Which is what the cynic latches onto and then wrongly generalizes about. I'm curious, one of the things that I would have perhaps expected to hear more about through the book, or named in this with this word, is the word justice. I'd like you to just comment on, how does justice play across the spectrum of the kinds of political sensibilities that your book is
Yeah.
advocating for?
It's a very good question. You know, when you look at the preamble to the Constitution, it says that the purposes of the Constitution are the first two: to form a more perfect union and to establish justice. And those are, I think, very connected and related purposes. And absolutely, ultimately, the purpose of our politics is to enable us to be a just society and
Yes.
to live together with one another in a just way. Oftentimes, the question is who gets to decide what is just? And of course, that's the hard question that democracies try to offer themselves up as an answer to.
Sure.
And the distinct answer of the American system is it's not simply that the majority gets to decide. It's a kind of mitigated majority, mitigated by a vision of politics that I think of as a Republican vision, small r, not the party, but a Republican vision that views the human person as equal in dignity with every other human being, as fallen and in need of formation, but also as capable of extraordinary greatness and ultimately
Yes.
as created in a divine image. And justice emerges as a political ideal out of those shared premises. I think those are actually very widely shared premises in American society. We don't agree about a lot of things, but I think we actually do believe that we're all created equal. I think we actually do believe that there is something dignified and even divine about the human being. And ultimately, the question of what should that mean for us as a practical matter is what we argue about in politics.
Yes.
So I think that the question of justice has to be present for us constantly in
Yes.
thinking about
Yes.
these questions and in thinking about the Constitution. We have to
Right.
make sure that it doesn't somehow entrench injustices, and to know that it has, right? I mean, the Constitution to begin with did abide, for example, the practice of slavery. One of the compromises at its origin was a decision to do nothing about slavery. It's not exactly a pro-slavery document, but it's a document written in an understanding that this tremendous injustice was happening in the society that they were looking to govern. And because doing anything about it would have made writing the Constitution impossible, they just didn't. And that was a gross injustice, and I think ultimately an unforgivable kind of mistake. And history did not forgive it. It forced the United States into a civil war in which 700,000 Americans killed each other. And, you know, I think when we say we are Americans, we have to say we are those people. Not only we are the people who did these great things and beat the Nazis and went to the moon, we are also the people who abided the practice of slavery and engaged in it for several hundred years. And we are also the people who fought that war. To own all of that, I think, is to recognize the moral complexity of life in a free society. It means that we should look to the Constitution for helping us through the problems we have, but also that we should recognize that it is a human institution and therefore by no means morally perfect, and we could do better.
Yuval, that's a very helpful answer. Would you put the negligence and abuse at that same period related to Native Americans in the same camp of something that simply was tolerated, not only tolerated, but fanned by the U.S. government at a time when the same kind of abuse of the dignity of Native Americans was being so brutally handled?
Yeah, I would. I think we have to see that also as a practice engaged in by Americans that we should see as having been profoundly wrong. And I would say,
Right.
you know, this relates to some of what we've been talking about. I think the challenge of thinking about the Constitution is in some ways the challenge of thinking about how to relate to a tradition that you are part of, that you inherited. And this is true for a lot of us about our religious traditions too. I've come to think that there's an analogy that can be useful between that challenge of how to relate to my tradition and the relation of parents and children in different times of life. There's a childish way to relate to a tradition, like a young child who thinks that his parents are perfect, and so we say, well, there's nothing wrong here, and there couldn't be anything wrong here, and the founders are just these men in marble on horses.
Yes.
Gradually, as that child matures, sometimes he or she will come to what I think of as a juvenile way to relate to their parents, which is to say, actually, they're not perfect. And you know what? They're perfectly wrong about everything. And the fact that these people lied to me about Santa Claus means that I can't trust them about anything. And there's that kind of juvenile relation to our tradition too, which says it's founded in lies, it's all wrong, its claims to be perfect
Yes.
aren't true. It is a
Yes.
disillusionment that can only follow illusionment, and those are both mistakes. But then there's a point in your life when, maybe when you have your own children, when you're sitting across from a 3-year-old and you say something like, "Don't eat your pasta with your hands," and you suddenly realize, I am my parents. That's my relation to them, is I'm in the place they were in. And some of what they did in this place was right, and I should really learn from it because they were much better at this than I was. Some of what they did in this place was terrible, and I should learn what not to do by looking
Yes,
at what they
yes.
did. That, it seems to me, is a mature relation to a tradition we are part of, so that we can look at the framers of the Constitution and say, they were doing what we are doing. They were trying to find a way for a divided society of imperfect human beings to live together. And some of what they did is amazing, and we should learn from it. And some of what they did is absolutely unconscionable, and we should make no excuses for it. And we can do both of those things at the same time, because we understand that they, like us, were imperfect human beings in a challenging situation. And so we can learn from them both what to do and what not to do. I think that is a mature relation to a tradition you're part of, whether it's political or religious or otherwise.
Right. Yuval, I really do want to just underscore how important this book is, I think, for anybody, wherever they are on the political spectrum, because you're raising so many fundamental questions that do describe and shape American culture and society in ways that are obviously profound, that have historically been the source of endless debate and conflict, and that we are in a very vulnerable time. So when people say these days, our democracy is at risk and we are facing, catastrophe, where do you go in your response to that observation, and what do you point to in addition to Congress as some of the primary elements of that?
Yeah. So I think one thing to recognize is that our democracy is often at risk. Our democracy is a fragile thing. And there are certainly some ways in which the risks it faces now are greater than usual. There's some ways in which it's faced much greater risks than this in the past. In not only in the 1860s, of course, but in the 1960s, in the 1930s. Yes. We've had levels of political violence in American life that were much greater than what we're facing now. We've had levels of division that were greater too. But there are some ways in which just the nature of this cultural moment, the decline of religion and family, do present us with, and just some individuals, I think Donald Trump is one of them, do present us with particular challenges that require us to think in ways distinct to this moment. But I think ultimately the core challenge is always with us. The core challenge is not only how do we live with people we disagree with without breaking apart, but how do we see those people as belonging with us, as being part of what we are. I call this book American Covenant because I think that a covenant is a way to think about political society that is ultimately better suited to this kind of challenge than, say, the social contract, which people talk about. A contract is an agreement that can be broken by either party if it's violated. And so in a sense, it's all about the violation of it. It describes the things that you need to do in order to not dissolve. A covenant is a relationship among those parties. It's an affirmation of a set of links and obligations. It ultimately says, we belong together. And I think Americans now have particular trouble not only saying we belong together, saying we at all about Americans. That we is the first word of the Constitution. We, the people of the United States. That we is an aspiration. It's not a fact, not simply. It's the purpose of the rest of the document. And I think that it's the purpose of a lot of American life. And so to think about the challenge of democracy, we have to be careful not to say, well, the threat to our democracy is them. It's those people. Those people are us. And we have to understand ourselves always in a kind of first-person plural in American life, and recognize that the challenge for our democracy is for us to stop saying them about other Americans and to find ways to understand all of us as part of one social and political whole. That's hard work, and every generation has to do it. And now it's our turn.
Yuval, this leads nicely into what I think will have to be our closing part of the conversation, and that is that this language of covenant, which is obviously the case, is intrinsic to a Jewish vision of the world. It's intrinsic to a Christian view of the world. And we know that part of the divided society is a divided church in America these days. You've had an opportunity from different angles to be able to have some pretty close observation about what it is that's going on in the American church. And just as you've given advice about the Constitution in the ways that you have so well in this book, I'm just curious as we close, what reflections would you have about the American church as a church that has a way of potentially contributing to this crisis on the one hand, but also to our nation's hope in certain ways? But it would have to be a changed and developed church that's different from the one that at least I'm seeing most days. So I'm curious, what observations or reflections would you have about how the American church should be living into these times? What does it have to contribute to this moment of social crisis?
Well, let me say first, I approach that subject humbly as an outsider, and I wouldn't pretend to know it from the inside. And I think there's always, for an outsider to approach my community and say, here's what you should be doing, my reaction to that might not be great. So,
right. But I am inviting it.
Yes, so I appreciate the invitation, but know that I do this with humility. I guess I would say that what has struck me in observing from the outside and in speaking with friends for many years now who are very involved in the inside of the institutions of American Christianity is that, in a sense, American Christians, American Protestants, maybe evangelicals, have had to come to understand themselves as a minority in American society rather than as the natural dominant majority. I don't know that truly faithful Christians have ever really been the majority in American society, but they did understand themselves as the rightful owners of the institutions.
Right.
And they have had to come over the past generation or so to see themselves as something of an embattled minority in many institutions. And I think that that's been difficult, and naturally it would be. I would say that the advice I would offer from the perspective of a minority religion, a small minority, is that there is actually tremendous potential in American life in being a moral minority, because it allows you to be true to yourself without expecting that everybody will agree.
Yes.
We can still close our business on Saturday, even though everybody else won't.
Yes.
And that doesn't mean we've failed. It means we can show our children how to live in a certain way. It also means we can show the larger society something important and try to shape it in the various ways available to us. And we offer them an alternative. We kind of hope they'll maybe join. And that is not a failure. So that to fail to win political power is not to fail to live morally as a religious community.
Right.
I think when you put it that way, it's obvious, but it's actually not really obvious. And I think a lot of Christian communities in America, some Catholics too, and not just Protestants, sort of judge their success as a religious community by their influence as a political bloc.
By dominance.
Yeah. And I think that that's understandable, but it is a mistake. And it undermines their capacity to offer a moral model, among other things. It undermines their capacity to be attractive to people, which is ultimately what it takes to actually become larger and maybe even become a majority. If you want to persuade, you have to be persuasive. And to insist that you're the rightful owner and you're being kept out when this is a democracy and people have a choice is not ultimately persuasive and attractive. And so I would say I think that is part of what many American Christians have had to think through and work through
Yes.
And in some ways, the particularly Madisonian logic of the Constitution is that everyone is a minority,
Right.
at least at some point, sometime. And that is not a position of weakness necessarily in this society. This is a society that is unusually solicitous of minorities. And when it's at its best, it is especially solicitous of minorities. When it's at its worst, it is oppressive of them. So we should judge it in that way and not approach it as the natural majority, but as people trying to be persuasive. And ultimately, that's how we can be at our best.
Yuval, these have been very, very rich points that you've been making and observations and reflections. I have benefited tremendously from reading American Covenant. I hope many other people will likewise. And I thank you very much for this conversation and for our friendship. It means a great deal to me.
Thanks so much, Mark. I really appreciate this.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Laberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Laberton. Thanks for listening with me.